It's all yours, Lloyd.
Okay, well, this is part 2 of longhouses. Last month, we talked about the longhouse from outside of the longhouse, looking at basically the structure of what made the longhouse the longhouse. And this month, we're going to do a little bit different. We're going to take a look at what went on the inside of the longhouse. And our objectives is who had authority in the longhouse? Who was the person that took command and control and managed the daily activities? Who were the people that actually lived in the longhouse? Not so much, from the different nations and things of that nature, but who were the individuals that were occupying space in the longhouse? And it might be a surprise to see who all was actually living inside of the dwelling itself. And how was the inside of the longhouse arranged? What did the internal portion, the structure, look like? In most cases, they would have all been relatively the same. One thing that's a little bit different that we have to kind of take a look at is how did the people dress? What was their daily attire? What did they kind of look like? And why did they wear what they wore? Because there were certain things that they wore that was very important during certain times of the year. Guests in the longhouse. While we're thinking about guests, try and think what type of a guest might actually be present inside of the longhouse and the basic necessities of the longhouse that go with it and the people that are involved inside the longhouse, games, ceremonies, and other things. And like last month, we don't have a tremendous amount of information about life in the longhouse strictly from a Wyandotte perspective. So I'm having to tap into some other nations, some other information, both pre-contact with, actually post-contact, just shortly thereafter, with some stuff that was obtained by the early Europeans. And then, of course, the Iroquoian people, the Haudenosaunee, there's quite a bit that had been preserved about them, so I'm using some of that as well, but it's all Iroquoian. Who had authority inside the longhouse? The women did. The women had authority. They were the ones that were in control of the daily life of the longhouse. And one thing that needs to be pointed out is that the women, as I put here, they weren't dominating demigods. They weren't walking around bossing everybody what to do, especially the men. They were an equal part of society along with the men, but they played some different roles because of the type of community that they were living in. The women did most of the labor, and that is what solidified them as being the owners of real property. They were the ones that tended the fields. They were the ones that cooked the meals. They were the ones that took care of the kids. They were the ones that basically made life function inside of the village. And because of that, they were, for the most part, the only owners of real property. They were the landowners. They were the owners of everything except for the personal items of their men. Each longhouse, as we saw last month, was identified by a marking that either represented the matriarch of that longhouse or her clan. And the matriarch was usually the eldest woman that was living inside of that longhouse. The little thing that I put down here at the bottom to kind of give you an idea of some of the busyness that was going on inside the longhouse. In many cases, the men weren't always there. They were out doing, as I say in my book, other manly things besides staying around and taking care of daily business inside the village. But the household was an ordered gaggle of many daughters, granddaughters, and likely great-granddaughters, all under the direction and authority of the longhouse matron. So we're going to see that there were a very extended family that took place inside of the longhouse, that lived inside the longhouse. The clan mothers, they had authority over the social political matters and they weren't present in every village. So all of the rules, the rights and duties, they were known throughout the nation, and they were correlative. The rights and the duties meant that if you had rights, you performed duties. If you had duties, you basically went with the rights. You couldn't have one without the other. Everybody played their part inside of society. The shaman had authority over everything that was ceremonial. The village chiefs, they had authority over local matters that consisted inside the village. And the matron, she had authority over their family, her family that was inside the longhouse. And every longhouse had its own matron. The shaman had knowledge and the authority over matters of the people's mind, body, and spirit, their well-being. And they played a big role inside of the longhouse. It may not have been the shaman himself or herself, but they had different priests that would have, in many cases, been present in every longhouse. Who lived in the longhouse? The women of a multi-generational family. The women's mates, they would have also occupied space in the longhouse, but they would not have been the same clan as the women. All of the women's children would have been inside the longhouse. Any males of the matriarch's longhouse that had not yet been chosen or taken themselves as a mate. One of the things that's unique about the Iroquoian people, the women were a little aggressive when it came to choosing who they wanted to have as a mate. If they saw somebody, they went after him. It wasn't the males that always chose the women. Sometimes it was more of the women choosing who they wanted to be their man. And if you were a male inside of a longhouse and you were 28, 30 years old, you had some troubles there. The Iroquois were a matrilocal people that were related by clans. The man went to live with his woman in her matron's longhouse. And this will give you an idea of how vast and how filled with people the longhouse was. The man didn't go live with his mother-in-law. He went to live with his grandmother-in-law, the sisters-in-law, the brothers-in-law, the aunts-in-law, the uncles-in-law, the nieces, the nephews, everyone. Anyone that was born into that matriarch's family came to live under her longhouse. So there could have been a lot of people living under the same roof. The longhouse was basically a single-story apartment complex. It wasn't anything overly glamorous. It was functional. It was roomy. There was plenty of people to house anywhere from 6 to 10 families. And if you look at the type of people that was living there, 6 to 10 families, there could be anywhere from 60 to 100 people that were living inside of one longhouse. The center of the longhouse was a long, wide, open communal area, basically served as kind of the courtyard under the roof. The center fires, and there could have been 3 or 4, maybe more, in the communal area. The center fires were shared by at least 2 families, one on either side of the building itself. And there could have been more than 2 families that shared one fire. They used the fire for warmth, of course, and also cooking their meals. They cooked their meals inside the longhouse, not outside in the open area. They had raised living spaces, and we'll see why those living spaces were raised here in a little bit. They were raised for a specific purpose. Those living spaces were a lot like bunk beds. They had various sizes, different lengths that were allocated to the families according to the size of the family. And above the living spaces, there were storage areas for personal belongings, food. They hung a lot of food from the rafters of the longhouse. And an interesting aspect of the longhouse is the living spaces, they might not have been that private. They were just basically a long bunk bed, and they could have been separated, or they may not have been separated by a robe, a buffalo or a bear robe, or a woven mat. The privacy inside the longhouse was kind of sparse at times. So what happened in the living spaces was never going to hinder life in the Longhouse. And there was one of those rights and one of those duties that belonged to the clan. One of those rights and duties, but they had to basically populate the clan. The clan spirit was always very unhappy if their names that were used for clan citizens was never filled. So to have forsaken one's duty as a man or woman to keep the clans well populated, it was a reproach if it wasn't done. The clan mothers were upset, and the matron of the Longhouse herself was upset. One of her jobs was to make sure that the people inside the Longhouse were having children. The mothers and the matrons insisted that the members, the family members inside the Longhouse had as many children as possible, because it was incredibly important to keep the clans populated. Picture here kind of shows a rough look inside of a Longhouse. You can see the communal area in the middle, the fires, the bunk beds, the lack of privacy with it just being basically wide open. How did the people dress? This is going to shake up a few people here. And I only present the information that I can find. So the ladies, they didn't wear nothing until they were 8 years old. The men, they were about 20 years old before they put on a loincloth. The ladies, they wore wraps that basically went from their waist to their knees. The men wore the loincloths. Everybody's familiar with that. And during winter, they wore heavy buffalo robes, bear robes to provide the extra warmth. Other garments, shawls, leggings, moccasins, they were worn when they were needed and necessary. And to present this about the lack of clothing, it's important because there was no shame. If you wore your birthday suit, it was just a normal thing. Today, we can't think of doing that. It's not part of our current society, but back then, it was normal. There was no weirdness about it. There was just no one that was just being strange and weird. However, the girls would be girls and the boys would be boys. The lack of clothing was well documented well into the early 19th century when the Methodist missionaries started showing up in Ohio. In 1816, John Stewart, when he got at the Grand Reserve, which it wasn't the Grand Reserve at that time, he was pretty taken back by the fact that the people were quite wild and most of them weren't wearing much clothing. One of the biggest objects that the Methodist missionaries had to deal with was getting clothing to clothe the children. In particular, there are some reports of how the clothing that they were wearing actually had a lot of living creatures inside the clothing. There was bugs and there was all kinds of things that today would be pretty gross unless you're an EMS, and you see that in people's homes every day. You go into some of these. It's pretty gross, but they didn't wear clothing for specific reasons. One, there were too many bugs that were everywhere. The bugs occupied the clothing, and if you can think, most of the clothing that they wore was animal skins, and those were just a natural abode for bugs. One thing too that was pointed out by Charles Trowbridge is our grandmas and grandpas, except for the hair on their heads, was plucked from their bodies. They did not have any hair on their bodies to help minimize the housing of the lice and the fleas and everything else that would have been inside the Longhouse. The women, they wore their hair back in a club that would have been hard for the bugs to get in. And of course, the men, they wore the scalp lock, which was only just a small portion of the hair. That kind of leads us into the guests. The guests in the Longhouse were a lot of mice. There's reports from the Iroquoian people, some of the missionaries that were with them, the mice were omnipresent. They were in everything all the time. The kids, part of their games was to keep the mice out of the food supplies. They were smart in taking a lot of their food, and they would pack around their food the leaves, very teeny tiny leaves of the sweet fern. The sweet fern kind of acted as kind of a repellent of the mice and some of the other bugs. But
Okay,
fleas,
just a minute.
yeah. Okay. Fleas and bed bugs were everywhere.
Hold on.
So they basically had their bunks up off the ground to keep away from the fleas so that they could sleep at night. During the winter, they would actually sleep down around the fires with their robes because of the heat.
Call him back.
But they had the bunks on the sides basically to raise themselves from the pests that were on the ground. And non-family members, extra people that were visiting inside the village, they did not sleep inside the longhouse. They had small guest huts that had been erected outside of the longhouses for people that would come and venture through the villages. Only family members slept inside the longhouse. It was a very close-knit environment. The longhouses had large areas for food. They stored food in vestibules and in the front side, the back side, the top side, anywhere that they could basically put food. They also dug pits in the floors so that they could store their food there. It gave extra protection from rodents. It also was a good place for them to store their seeds for the next year's crops. And there would have been an elderly woman that distributed the food to each of the family members inside of the longhouse daily. That way, if they had reserve, they had extra, everybody ate a little bit more. And it was important for her to make sure that everybody got an equal share because there were times when the food would run a little low. Restrooms. There were no restrooms in the longhouse. The people, they did bathe. There's a lot of accounts where they bathed daily. If they didn't bathe inside of a creek or a river or some pond, they would at least wash themselves with a bowl and water. The village had more than one sweat lodge in many cases, but there was always at least one sweat lodge. The men were only allowed inside the sweat lodge. So the men would use that at least twice a year to cleanse themselves. And each village had at least one. In some cases with the larger villages, they had what was called middens. The middens are basically the village landfill. It's the latrine. It's where they dumped all of their residual garbage, which would also be what their bodies produced. They would collect what they basically had to do, number one or number two, if you will. And then they would take the number one or the number two and they would throw it into the midden so that there was a centralized area inside, usually inside the village, protected so that they could venture there in times of attack or something. But they didn't have but these designated places so that the obvious things that go with raw sewage in the streets, like you see in Europe and some of the cities on the Atlantic coast, that was not an issue inside the villages because they had.
Are you still examining?
I just got done.
Okay, don't yell at me.
Games were played inside the longhouse.
I'm trying to get through my day and be in.
Games were inside the longhouse. Our game, the most common, the most wildly played, the most sacred game was the game of bones. And it's known today predominantly by the name peach seed game. We haven't played this game probably in over 100 years. It'd be nice at the gathering if we could renew the playing of bones. It's basically the same thing as the Seneca Cougas peach seed game. Other games that were played inside of the longhouse, the boys climbed in the rafters and they played boys games. The girls, they had their corn husk dolls and they would have played longhouse. They would have trained themselves to be forthcoming mothers. Oral traditions were told around the fire in the longhouse. Ceremonies were conducted and councils were held also in the longhouse. So the longhouse was a place of gathering for the citizens of the village and the nation. Every single day there was something going on inside of a longhouse, whether it be a family event, a village event, or a tribal event. The longhouses were key. And the woman, the matron, she was queen over everything. She didn't tell people what to do. People had enough honor and respect for her that they often did what they know they should do without having to be asked. People knew the boundaries. They knew where they needed to go and where they shouldn't go. So life in the longhouse would have been totally different than what we know today. And that's all. A lot of stuff, hopefully within our allotted time. Might be a little bit longer than normal, but there's the sources for a lot of stuff that's in the slides today. I'm starting to give everybody those. So if you want to do a little bit of research on your own, there's some good stuff right there. Okay, any questions? It's kind of
Tell me
quiet.
again. I'm sorry. Tell me again. I was going through a dead spot and had a hard time hearing. What was it called? That it was a hole that was dug in the middle, and that's where they threw their refuse.
It was called a, well, they didn't call it, but the Europeans, when the archaeologists, it's called a midden. A midden, M-I-D-D-E-N. And that is basically the equivalent today of a landfill. All the broken things of the village, all the pots, the earthenware, everything that was broken went inside the midden. Any refuse went inside the midden. Anything produced by the bodies went inside the midden. It was basically just the village landfill. And the archaeologists today, they search out those middens because those middens contained a lot of valuable information and wealth that shows the daily activities of the people in that village.
Listening to this really makes you, people say, oh, learn traditions, live like we used to. I mean, show of hands, who really wants to live like that?
Well, when we sit back and look back, what our grandmas and grandpas did looks very appealing because we are consumed by our contemporary society. We think that back then they had an easy life, that it was nothing but, songs and dances and stories and feasts and everything that we look at as being glamorous. But the lives of our grandmas and grandpas would have been very difficult. Just living every single day inside of the village, inside of the longhouse would have been a challenge. That's why they had the elderly lady making sure that their food supply was always properly dispensed among the family members, because food, when it's gone, when it was gone, it was gone. They couldn't run down to Price Cutter or any other grocery store and buy more. So we are spoiled beyond belief today in our little protected and enclosed society. Back then, it would have been very, very difficult. And people didn't know anything other than just to do as they did. It was just a part of their life.
Amanda asked, what did they use to pluck the hair? Her fingers would not be strong enough.
They didn't just reach in and grab a handful of hair and pluck it, because if you've ever tried to do that to a head of hair, you can see how hard that is. But they would take and they would put their hands inside of charcoal, inside of something that would give them a little bit of roughness and texture, something that would give a enhanced gripping ability. Charcoal was one of the most common things that they used. They would completely coat their fingers in a nice layer of charcoal, and they would grab just a little patch of hair, twist it and pull it all at the same time. And it would take a while for the men to actually pluck the hair from their scalp for the scalp lock. It didn't basically Well, it took hours. Where we go to the barber now and we're in and out in 20 minutes, they would have sat and actually plucked the hair over the course of an afternoon or a full day. But they commonly use charcoal on their fingers to aid in the stickiness and the tactfulness of their fingers to get the hair out of the head. And I mentioned too that they plucked the hair from their bodies, which they didn't have a lot of hair on their bodies. That was one thing that the Europeans noticed, that most of the nations, the people didn't have a lot of hair. But if they had hair, can you imagine plucking that from your armpit? Oh my goodness. That would have been a tearful event. So they were tough, very, very tough people. Talking about taking of a bath, they didn't stop taking a bath during wintertime. They would take a bath during winter. They were a lot more hardened to the weather than what we are today. If they needed to take a bath, they would have gone out and they could have taken a bath on a frozen river. It may not have been frozen, but outside there could have been snow on the ground, but they would have still bathed even in the middle of winter. The cleanliness of the people was very important, because if you can imagine having 60, 80, 100 people all together inside of the Longhouse, oh my. Sometimes that BO might be a little hard for people to endure. So their cleanliness was something that they focused on every single day. It was not cool to be unclean.
That's a good segue into Amanda's next question. Did they use anything as soap during the bath? Is there a type of plant?
No, there were no plants in the Great Lakes region. In my new book, That Time Is Gone, I spent months trying to find what they actually used for soap. And there is no form of a natural type of a soap that they would have had in Ohio or Ontario before they actually were dispersed. So a soap was not there in society. There was some body washes that I found. A body wash was made from, what's the name of the tree? Can't think of the name of the tree right off, but they used the sap from a tree, the bark. They boiled down the bark into a sap and they used it for cleansing wounds and washing their bodies. But I did find where the way that they would bathe would be to take charcoal and kind of some sand, and they would use that to just kind of rub their bodies down to remove all of the collected debris. And then they would use, at times when the weather would permit, they would use what we would call today a mud bath. They would coat themselves down with clay, basically to sit back and bake themselves in the sun until that clay would harden. Then they would pull the clay off, and that clay would remove all of the things that had basically embedded inside of their skin. A lot of people today, they take mud baths, so it's therapeutic. It actually helped renew their skin because their skin was exposed to the sunshine, the elements every day of their lives. So the mud baths were important when they could afford to do one. But most of them just bathed inside of a creek, inside of a river, inside of a pond, a standing body of water, and just rinsed themselves down with what they had, which would have been charcoal, mud. That would have been the cleansing things that they got. But eventually the people would have acquired lye soap from their trades or their raids with the whites. They learned how to do lye soap by the early 1800s. As for bar soap, didn't exist.
I had also heard that possibly use bear grease.
Bear grease, there was another oil that they used, sunflowers. They would have used the sunflower oil, like when they took the mud bath, after they had rinsed off the residue from the caked on mud, they would have wiped their skin down with sunflower oil or bear oil. The bear oil, the sunflower oil was kind of used as a It's just a body coating, a body oil. So that would have helped to remove some of the stuff that was on the skin as well. To actually bathe in it, the only time that I saw where they actually did like a oil bath would be the men just prior to going into the sweat lodge. They would do an oil bath to cleanse themselves before they actually sweat. The women never went into the sweat lodges. It was a exclusive male thing. But there were some instances where they did do oil baths, either bear grease or most likely the sunflower oil.
Interesting.
And bear grease, when we think of that, we think of, pork lard, things of that nature, the grease that we cook with the bacon. Bear was not that way. The best way that you can compare the oil of a bear, the grease of a bear, is it's very similar to olive oil. It was liquid at standing room heat, just ambient heat. It was a liquid oil, just about like what the sunflower oil is. That would be equivalent to either the bear or the sunflower to olive oil today.
I see BZ raised her hand, Betty Zane.
Yeah, am I on? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Lloyd, have you come across any information about birthing rituals or traditions? What kind of support there may have been for the women during childbirth?
There's not a lot that I've come across that is Wyandotte. I have incorporated in my book some Ojibwe information about the women, primarily some teas that they would have brewed for the women that were in labor.
Mm-hmm.
And when one of the ladies was in labor, she had the whole women that were inside the Longhouse. She would have had a lot of help when it come to birthing. She would have had her mom, her grandma, her aunts, everybody was there. And they helped with birth by the brewing of teas. And I can't find anything that specifically tells of hours, but the Ojibwa had several different leaves and roots that they would have boiled that would have enhanced the ability for the body to birth and to also help with the bleeding that would have obviously been part of the afterbirth.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been a very troubling ordeal if the placenta didn't fully birth. There would have been a lot of deaths associated with birth because of the placenta not coming completely out or a small portion of it there. They had some of the teas that were actually useful for helping constrict the uterus during birthing. But as for anything relevant to our traditions, it's very difficult to find because the medicines, anything associated with any of the shamanic traditions, it was an actual tribal law that was, it would cost your life if you would have shared any of the medicines with anybody that was not a tribal citizen. So a lot of the tribal citizens never spoke of those things to the missionaries, to the people that were coming through the villages, because it literally could have cost their life if they would have been overheard telling of the remedies, the medicines and things that were used during birthing and other things during the daily lives of the people. One thing too that I did a lot of research on was, what did the women do during their time of the month? What did they do when their period was there? And there's quite a bit that was recorded about the Wyandotte people. But again, there's not a lot on our ladies. From what I can tell, they actually would barricade themselves in the corner of a longhouse or inside of a lodge, or they had a small hut outside of the lodge or the longhouse where they would isolate themselves during their week. It was a taboo for any of the blood to actually have touched anyone else, especially one of the men. And they would have also had their teas that would have helped with their menstrual period. They could have used cattails, any type of mosses to actually aid in in the flow that they would have had. But, you know, those type of things we don't really think about. How did they take care of just the normal daily things that would have been part of both the men and the women? You know, we were talking earlier about it being different, and it was totally different. So they had a lot of taboos that were associated with a lot of these things today that are very private for a lot of the ladies.
Kishime,
Amanda asked, how many children would the average family have?
Average family would have varied between like 4 to 7 children. There are some accounts that go back early, where some of the women would have 8, 10, 12 children. But that is during the time that they would have been birthing, that would have been a horrible stress upon the ladies' bodies. So they actually had, in most cases, 5 to 7 children per woman. And it was important to have as many children as possible because they were the ones that took care of mom and dad. We were always at war, so attrition took a heavy toll. Having a lot of men to replace those lost during war was important. And in time, the numbers got so bad that that's where the adoptions came in. By the time we left Ohio, the tribe was more white, if you will, than it was native born because of the adoptions that were necessary to keep the tribe up to a population. So families, 5 to 7. Any other questions, comments? Okay.
Marilyn said she must be tired because she can't think of any.
Oh, that's scary.
It's probably allergies are affecting a lot of people right now, I feel like, around us anyway.
Allergies, and there's been some really nasty stomach viruses going around that's really
Oh no.
tapping a lot of people. They're just wore out from that.
Oh, I hope we don't have people suffering with that.
So next month, at the last meeting that we had, we talked about some topics for the coming months. And next month, we talked about having a little talk about some foods, strange foods, as we had mentioned. So next month, we're going to be talking about some foods. What did our grandmas and grandpas eat? What were some of the weird things that they ate? And what were some of the things that they would never, ever, ever dream of eating? So that should be an interesting little discussion.
Sounds interesting.
Who here has eaten some deer, or who has not eaten some venison? Anybody?
Venison pepperettes are the best thing I've ever had in my life.
It's great. What about
Eat
raccoon?
a lot of deer.
I've not eaten raccoon.
I haven't either.
Raccoon's a little bit harder to
I
get.
have.
Pretty good, isn't it, Bert? Tastes just like chicken, right?
Yep, had both of them.
uh,
Where do you
I don't
get
plan
it?
on
Depends on how
eating
you cook
raccoon,
it.
venison and elk. I like,
Oddly enough, raccoon tastes a lot like a greasy venison.
Mm.
Tastes a lot like venison, but man, it's got some grease in it.
Are you eating roadkill, Lloyd?
What's that?
Are you eating roadkill?
Why heavens no.
How did
I
you get it? Did you hunt it? Mm.
Mom and dad, they have some acreage down south of Branson. They've got just shy of 50 acres down there, right in the middle of the sticks and the hills. And Dad, he feeds the donkeys a lot of good store-bought food. It's their snacks. And the raccoon, they like to come into his supply of donkey food. And he will, from time to time, get a big old raccoon that just tears the place up. So any of the raccoon that I've had, we've actually trapped them
Oh, okay.
because of being a menace.
That-
But to do roadkill, no. Our grandmas and grandpas would not have eaten anything that was found
I
dead.
tell you, you tried to get me to eat roadkill before.
I play and tease you a lot, Kim. No, there's just lines that we won't cross, but no roadkill.
Good.
And we'll talk about the things that they wouldn't eat and things that they wouldn't pass up next month. Roadkill is something they would not have touched, but there would have been no roadkill back then.
No.
So
Okay,
you're safe, Kim.
Do what?
I said you're safe. He's not going to bring
Yeah.
you roadkill.
Yeah.
No. But
I'm pretty open to trying new things, but that roadkill, no.
I would like to get you some raccoon.
I would try it.
Yeah,
I mean,
everybody,
I've tried a lot of things, but
yeah, everybody needs to do venison, try some venison,
yeah. I've
because
had
it
that.
was incredibly important. And raccoon, it was also important. So maybe one of these days during the gathering, we can expose our people to some of these finer things in life and have a big old venison roast or a raccoon roast one day,
Yeah.
because it can be commercially purchased. Although nowadays it'd be a little pricey, but
We'll just take a few traps down to your dad's.
we could do that.
Yeah.
That sounds like it'd be pretty good in Three Sisters stew.
Yeah.
It would be, yeah.
I'm game.
Chris will
Okay.
cook
we'll
it
do
up for us.
it.
All right.
Okay.
I'm gonna turn the recording off now.